So with that, I'm going to introduce our first panel of the finalists. That is Martine Barons, David Underdown, and Thijs Fonseca. And their research is Safeguarding a National Digital Memory, a Bayesian decision model for digital preservation risk. So over to you, Martine.
Martine, you're on mute.
Thank you. So can you see my slides now?
We can see your slides, but I'm not sure if they're on presentation mode.
Okay. Sorry about this. How about that?
It's okay. Let's go for it. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much for the opportunity. It's already a great honor to be a finalist in such a prestigious award. So today we're going to be talking about archives and the importance of archives and why this decision analysis has really made a big difference. So why are archives critical? We have a sense of identity from our personal narratives, from our community narratives, and from our national narratives. And this tells us who we are. It's really important, isn't it, for the process of law and order, for good records to be kept. In the UK, we had a stadium disaster back in 1989, and that's still going through the courts for various reasons. And so it's really important that those records that do exist are preserved and preserved properly. And actually, archives underpin democracy in the sense that we have good records to hold our leaders to account. We're all very aware, are we not, of the controversy and legal actions surrounding the retrieval of documents from former President Trump's residence, for example. So Dave is going to talk to us about what the National Archives in the UK do.
So we're broadly the Archive of UK Government. We're a non-ministerial department within the civil service. We're also the official publisher for the UK Government and kind of the predecessor bodies, the Great Britain and England, and also the current devolved Welsh administration. So we're the guardians of over 1,000 years of iconic national documents, but also expert advisors in information and records management. And it's a cultural, academic and heritage institution. We fulfill a wider leadership role for archives, particularly in England, and we're working to secure the future of both physical and digital records. So we collect and secure the future of the government record right back to the 11th century Doomsday Book via Shakespeare's will, right up to tweets from number 10 Downing Street today, and we're preserving that for generations to come. So when we were looking to develop initially for ourselves a risk model and decision support tool, we also took, in the light of our sector leadership role, we wanted to make sure that anything we developed along those lines was broadly applicable and had a good solid evidence base, drawing on the experience of a wide range of archives of different types. So next slide, please, Martine. Challenges for archives currently, born digital materials are complex, rich, fragile, and technologies rapidly changing even now. Government departments are starting to use artificial intelligence and machine learning models in the course of their operations. So we need to start to understand how those can be archived so that future historians can understand the decisions made and support future research. Government departments, several are also moving to use things like Google Suite for documents. So a Google document, there isn't really an underlying file to be archived. So there's challenges there in how we take those records from government departments as they come up for transfer. Also, the majority of archivists come from a humanities background, so they've had little exposure to probability and statistics or wider digital methods. So when we were creating this, trying to create something that was easily understandable was very important. There's been a wide range of good practice in digital preservation developed over the last 20, 25 years, but there hasn't always been the quantitative evidence base to go with it. So we also needed to try and encourage better gathering of data, or there was limited publicly available data on some of the risk areas we identified, and there can be a reluctance to share data when things have gone wrong. We did initial exploratory work of our own in the National Archives, but realised we didn't have the skills and experience. So that was when we then turned to the Applied Statistics and Risk Unit at Warwick and Martine, and they were critical in enabling the successful development of what's become Diagram, the digital archiving graphical risk assessment model. Back to you, Martine.
So the first thing we had to do was to get a clear problem statement, to get a statement of the problem so that everybody involved, all the analysts and all the experts, could actually coalesce around this clear statement. And the quote from John Sheridan at the bottom of my slide really kind of sums it up. What issues do we try to preempt? What do we problem solve when the need arises? All about migration and emulation. When do we do this? When do we do that? So essentially, the problem was we don't know which of these strategies are going to give us the result we need right now. So we set up a series of decision conferences with the National Archive, TNA experts, but also experts across the archive sector who were safeguarding different types of digital objects, who had different funding levels, who had different experiences. And the first thing we needed to do was to identify what are the risk factors, what are the factors which can allow things to go wrong. And then we had to think about what is the relevant granularity of the model. So of course, as analysts, it was our responsibility to help teach the experts in archiving about how to think about what is a risk factor in terms of does it directly affect or indirectly affect the quantity of interest. And also, most experts in their own domain want to model every last piece of the system, and that's quite understandable. But then to come and introduce this idea that there's a relevant granularity that will give us the bulk of the information we need without necessarily having to go down to the nth degree. The next thing we had, well, what is the quantity of interest? In order to be useful for decision making, there had to be some kind of measure of success or utility that actually was measurable and made sense in the actual domain. And of course, we had to take advice on that because we are analyst experts, we are not archive experts. And so again, we would do this by another one of our decision conferences. So by now, the archivists were getting to know each other quite well. Some of them had pre-existing relationships anyway. We're beginning to think about the problem in a new way. And the two things that they decided would be the most useful things was renderability, which is the ability to see the digital object such that it could be used for its intended purpose, and intellectual control. So is this digital object the same being presented to me, the same as the one that was actually submitted to the archive? So having identified the risk factors, then we had to explore the relationships between them. And we did this by use of an influence diagram. We showed the archivists how an influence diagram works and how they could draw one, how to think about what the arrows actually mean in terms of dependencies. So we had several iterations of this. We introduced that idea, and then we sort of mixed up the groups of people so that people from different types of archive were together. This got a really rich set of conversations going about, well, I couldn't do that in my archive, that wouldn't be relevant. As David said, we really wanted this to be applicable not just to the well-funded National Archive, but actually to all the archives who were taking part. And then we got them together to present their influence diagrams and had a facilitated discussion around things and came to a consensus influence diagram that everybody could really get behind, that was represented, at least at some granularity, their understanding of how the system worked. David, I think you're going to talk to us about the data sources we had available.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, there was in the intro, archives may not have been collecting data at all in several key areas, perhaps about where physical failures of infrastructure were occurring. A number of standard surveys existed, but maybe didn't ask quite the questions we needed, but we could begin to use those as a proxy, or things where the data that was available was going perhaps far too detailed and granular. You know, there are lots of statistics out there about general sort of hard drive failures and things like that, but bringing that up to the level we needed for this was quite tricky at times. And again, this is where we needed the real input from Martine and Thais.
So in order to fill the data gaps, we turned to another analysis tool, and this was structured expert judgment. We chose the IDEA protocol, formal protocol for having some empirical control over the quality of the data. This was actually verified and tested on the DARPA forecasting competitions. And briefly, what you do is you ask the experts who are well informed about the area to give you answers to the questions that you have, but they do it in a private way. One of the things that the protocols for structured expert judgment do is to mitigate against the biases that naturally occur when people are in groups, like groupthink or deferring to the expert and so on and so forth. So having answered all the questions, they had a facilitated discussion about why a quantity should be as large as this, or under what conditions it could be as low as this, and so on and so forth. And then they had a second confidential estimate, and this is so that they could change their mind or not, having heard the evidence that they have. In amongst those questions were calibration questions, which were carefully phrased in a very similar way. In each case, it was out of 1,000 records, how many would you expect? Because natural frequencies are much easier for people to visualize if they're not their core skill is not in probability distributions. And that allowed us to do some analysis which experts were best at quantifying their uncertainty about something, and which ones should be upweighted and downweighted in the final result. And what you get is, for example, this was question 36. You would get a range of experts. We had 19 experts in the room, and you can see the pink one at the top is very, very certain, because the left-hand end is the lowest plausible value, such that they'd be very surprised if it were lower, and we take that as the 5th percentile of the distribution. And the right-hand end is similarly the 95th, the highest plausible, such that they'd be very surprised if it was higher. And the middle is actually the best estimate, what they think is the truest estimate of the real quantity. And when we do this for calibration questions, of course, we can then say that we have the answer. And what you really want are experts who the distance between their lowest and highest is reasonably small, so they're very informative, but also they capture the correct answer, so they're also accurate. So those informativeness and accuracy are what the weights are derived from for weighting the experts. So since this was used to be used by the archive sector, we needed to display the tool in a way that would be user-friendly and customize it to their situation. So what the archives can do is they can enter some baseline information about their particular archive, which adjusts the diagram tool, which is the tool version of all this analysis that we did. And they can actually enter and get a value for intellectual control and for renderability for their particular archive. And there are also two comparative models in there, because it's no good getting a score of 18 without knowing whether 18 is good, bad, or indifferent, is it? So there's one that's kind of similar to the National Archive, a well-funded National Archive, and the other one is a very basic cloud storage situation. So people can not only see what their scores are, they can see where they fit in the sector. And then they can go about exploring the space by changing things. If we had extra staff, if we had extra training, if we had other things. And they can see the picture of the consensus influence diagram about all the things that are included and not included. So if there's something they really feel for their particular archive is not included, we wouldn't hope that would be the case, but they can then actually post hoc, they can include that as well. They'll know what's included, what isn't included, and there is a possibility for advanced users to do some further customization. So we are very pleased to get some good endorsement from the actual sector, because the Digital Preservation Awards happen every year, and in 2021 we were a finalist there. And it really emphasized, how it helps archivists to assess the impact of multiple related risks and what happens to the overall risk under different interventions. And there was a user who picked up this tool and used it for their particular archive, and really had some very nice things to say about the sort of visualizations that we produce, and something that non-specialists in some sense can understand, something that can be easily presented to a manager for a funding bid. And Dave is going to tell us how the National Archive used this.
So UK government runs a spending review every few years, typically, and that's when departments are bidding essentially for the funding they need. So in 2020, we started using Diagram to help put our business case to the Treasury. So we started by modelling our as-is risk levels, and then we designed a counterfactual model based on just receiving a flat cash settlement, so no increase in funding, which is obviously a real terms cut, and then versus the position of risk if the submitted business case was approved. We did that over kind of 5-year and 25-year horizons. We also demonstrated the value offered to government in general by the archive through the transfer of records from departments, by demonstrating that there's increased risk to digital material that remains with the originating government department. We're also building a new service called Transfer Digital Records, a cloud service that's designed to make the process of transfer much easier, with less manual work and more support for creating the kind of packages of records in an automated fashion, rather than it's still quite a manual process currently of creating spreadsheets of metadata and copying the set of records to be transferred to a USB drive. And then next slide, please, Martine. And then that spending review went only for a year. So then in 2021, we had to update that and seek funding for what's expected to be a 3-year period. So again, we were demonstrating in the follow-on business case the risk level change that had happened as a result of the work we'd already undertaken from that initial year period, quantifying that, showing we'd spent that money effectively and wisely, that public money, taxpayers' money. In addition, we'd taken on a new responsibility for publishing court and tribunal judgments, that was about to be transferred to the National Archives. So we did additional modelling to show how this would, taking on this responsibility, would reduce the risk to this material. UK being like the US, a common law jurisdiction, so this case law, the decisions of courts and how they've arrived at them, is a vital complement to our pre-existing responsibility for actually publishing the statute book, the UK's primary and secondary legislation. So with this modelling, we could then help make the case for the precise level of funding we needed to take on this additional work and develop the new systems that would be necessary to support it. Martine?
Thank you. So Diagram has achieved reach already well beyond the UK. We were able to include non-UK archives in the user testing. but there's also helping other archives to use it in similar ways to provide evidence for their funders. Also being used for training of archivists. So the University of Virginia have got this on their professional development as part of their professional development, so people can think about risk and so on. David, you want to mention this?
So yeah, the enduring benefit, we have a 3-year support contract in place with a data analytics firm called Jumping Rivers, and we'll soon be launching the official kind of live version. Up to now it's been a prototype, and we've transformed the prototype, which was in Shiny Apps, to a fully web accessible interface in AWS. Model logic's been separated more out into a backend in R with an API connecting to a native HTML front end. And we've improved the advanced modeling options as well as part of this update, so that it's much easier for those people who really want to interact directly with the conditional probability tables underlying each node of the network. I'm acting as the product manager, so I'll also be looking for opportunities to further develop the depth and breadth of the model, keep the evidence base up to date by incorporating updated data, and Warwick have a kind of partnership program, so there will be potentially the opportunity to work with masters and doctoral students to make their research projects part of that, and provide them with a kind of real world case for their research to directly impact straight away. Other things, perhaps looking at the peer archives, national archives around the world to broaden the evidence base. Most of the evidence is UK focused at the moment. And then, hopefully this will also demonstrate the areas where archives need to be collecting the data. So over time, we can perhaps replace some of the structured expert judgment with hard data from actual cases. And generally, helping archives use this model, get out there, use it to influence their funders and stakeholders, explaining how to do that for them. Martine?
Thank you. Then to conclude, this is the first decision analysis tool for assessment of risk to digital archives. We've combined decision conferencing with influence diagrams, multi-attribute utility, structured expert judgment, and user testing to bring it to life. It's really vital due to our identity, to our legal due process, and to supporting democracy. And it has been used already for business case, for return on investments, for substantial budget uplifts. And it enables archives to think differently and also to make decision making through scenario planning. And it now has global reach. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martine and David. What an interesting presentation. Really helps us think about archives in a whole new way. And I wanted to mention that we're now going to have a period of questions and answers. The judges will have the first chance to ask questions and answers, or receive answers, and then questions from the audience will be welcomed if time allows. Please type your questions into the Q&A section of Zoom. We're not monitoring chat for questions, so please, again, into the Q&A function. So now I'd like to open it up to my committee members who would like to ask a question. Nadia?
Yes, thank you, Carol, and thank you to Martine and David for their excellent presentation. I have a couple of questions. The first one is that you adopted the IDEA protocol, and I wanted to ask you why was that the case, and whether you considered any other alternatives. And my second question is that an aspect of your project was to identify risks, but there was another softer aspect of your project. You had to take decisions about the composition of the group of experts. You had to invite facilitators. So there is a question over the performance and how well the facilitators performed. So just a quick comment of how challenging this softer part of the project was.
Thank you very much for an excellent question. So the IDEA protocol is a relatively new protocol, and it combines the strengths of a number of more established protocols. We've used it on a number of occasions and found it to be excellent. So it combines the Cook protocol in the sense that it has the calibration questions and allows us to assess the expertise of the experts. But it also has the facilitated discussion, which you might find in a Sheffield or a Delphi protocol. So it has this idea that, you know, you're not on your own entirely, that actually in the second round, which is the data that you use, you are, everybody has access to the same information. And sometimes it's the sort of, again, it's part of the softer side, I suppose. One of the things that does come up, but people think they've answered the same question, but actually they've subtly, slightly differently understood. And then we can have an agreement about what the question is that we need to know. And then we can actually answer in the second round, we can answer more accurately. And one of the nice things about the IDEA protocol is you can usually see in the second round, if you do the weighted judgments, you can actually see with the calibration questions that experts tend to move towards the truth. They do get more accurate in that sense. So it's a protocol we're familiar with. It has a good deal of strength. So in terms of the softer side, since I did most of the facilitation, Dave, you'll have to make the comment. I rather enjoyed it, I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, certainly from our side, it seemed to work pretty well. I mean, before we started on it, we had put together a set of archives who were interested in working on this together. We'd put together a funding bid for the National Lottery Heritage Fund in the UK, which is partly why we went with all UK archives at this point, just because that was where the funding was coming from. So we discussed quite a bit with Warwick in advance, the kind of things we would need. As we said, we were looking for a range of archives. So we had local authority, local record offices, university archives, corporate archive, as well as ourselves, the National Archives. And actually, one advantage in the end of the COVID pandemic was we switched all our events to online events, which reduced some of our funding requirements. Obviously no hiring of rooms and things, so we were able to bring in a slightly wider range of experts as well. So we also brought in some people from the British Film Institute, National Film Archive, and further kind of university and the copyright libraries in the UK, bringing in a wider range of things with web archives and things as well.
I think as this audience will probably all be aware, as coming in as the analyst, you learn an awful lot about a new domain, and that can be challenging, getting the language right, can't it? And having your experts in front of you, and there's always somebody who is reluctant to speak and somebody else who won't stop. So there are, you know, a lot of ways of just being smiley and kind, but making sure that this is a facilitated discussion, so you do bring out all of the participants and make sure you capture their views and give them a space to speak.
Yes, and well, I mentioned in the presentation that most archivists tend to be from humanities backgrounds. I'm an exception. I have a maths degree, so I was able to kind of act as a bit of a translator, I think, between the statisticians and the archivists both ways.
Thank you.
Carol, you're on mute. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. The role of the code switcher. Any other questions from the judges? I'm not seeing anybody's hand up, so. All right, then. Let me ask a quick question from the audience. One question is, there multi-attribute utility and Bayesian methods were used. There are many different risk analysis tools. How was the method selected?
The method was really selected, driven by the application, just the way in which the risk factors pull together, and having to be able to use the prior information about a particular archive. It just really suited Bayesian methods. And wanting to have something which was transparent as well, because it's really important that the users have confidence in it, in which case they have to understand it. So at the moment, the two attributes of utility are equally weighted, and that's made clear, and that's something that you can adjust. and they understand what these two things are, because these are words they use in their everyday language. So it's really important to us to suit the analysis to the problem, rather than come as a hammer looking for a nail, in that sort of sense. So it's really about, this project took nominally sort of 18 months, but actually in practice it's more like 3.5 years, because there was a whole period of negotiating the project up front, where you do sort of little bits and pieces and get people on board about what could be possible. Then you do actually do the project, and then as David's taken on ownership of the tool, there is more projects to be done in terms of some of the risks that are encoded in there are specific, well, not specific to UK, but some of the things are missing. So we don't have huge wildfires in the UK, so that is missing and that needs to go in now. We don't have earthquakes threatening archives, and so on and so forth.
All right, well, we have time for one more quick question, and I'm going to read it verbatim from the chat here. Is the objective to measure the quality of the archive object transfer?
No, the objective is that once it's here, once it's arrived, can we be sure that it is the object that you're seeing? If you access the archive, we are presenting to you the object we received, and we have certainty, we have a level of certainty about the renderability, you'll be able to see it, but also we have the intellectual control side of it is that we can say with certainty, or reasonable certainty, that actually what you're seeing is what we got. So we decided we could have modeled the ingestion process, but we decided that actually it was when it arrives in, and that, because that ingestion process is very different between archives, isn't it, David?
Yes, although that all said, we do have there's the notion of checksum. One of the questions asks if you have a checksum for the object, a message digest, which was created before the object was transferred. So in that case, we can say it was definitely, exactly what the person was using. In some cases, particularly for older digital material, that may not have existed. So there can be some uncertainty. Maybe that object had decayed before that checksum, or been damaged before that checksum was created. So that there can be a little bit of a gap there in terms of whether we can absolutely say it was transferred exactly as it existed. In some cases we can say that, but not always.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Thanks so much for the great presentation. And we're going to be going on to the next presentation now. Hilda, if you could put up the slide. So the second presentation we have here is the framework for adaptive management of horseshoe crab harvest and red knot conservation in the Delaware Bay. And I'd like to turn this one over, I believe, to David Smith. David Smith, I believe, is the speaker.
Brian News, actually.
Brian.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I'd like to begin by thanking the Practice Award Committee for inviting us here and inviting me to give this presentation to you. I'll be discussing a large, long-running effort to build and maintain this adaptive resource management framework for horseshoe crabs and red knots in the Delaware Bay. And I'll begin by giving some background on the problem, talk about the first phase of this adaptive resource management program, which began some years ago, and then the part of the program that I've been involved in, which is this revision that's happened over the past 2 or so years, and then give some conclusions. Here are the main characters in this story: the horseshoe crab here on top and the red knot below that. We'll talk more about them in a moment. So I want to emphasize here that I'm representing a large team of people from a diverse set of agencies and university faculty, both state and federal agency representatives. And so I just want to make that point that I'm representing a lot of different experts in different parts of this whole process. Okay, so on to the context for the program. First of all, the setting for this is Delaware Bay, which is on the east coast of the United States here. It's a protected and highly productive estuary with beach and marsh shorelines. It's bordered directly by Delaware and New Jersey, but benefits fisheries in adjacent states as well. And as such, fisheries within the bay are regulated by this this organization called the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, which allows states to come together and collectively set regulations for fishery harvest. At the same time, it's an important stopover site for migrating shorebirds. You see some of them here, gathered together to eat the eggs of the horseshoe crabs, which you can see kind of churning about in the rich waters off the beach there. So the horseshoe crab, one of the stranger marine animals, in at least in waters that I've seen, and it, beyond being sort of remarkable in its own right, it provides food resources for wildlife by spawning in these high densities on beaches, and Delaware Bay is particularly high densities in the month of May. And the eggs that are deposited in the sand are then fed on by migrating shorebirds in huge numbers. However, they're also harvested by people, and the crabs are used for bait in these traps for eel and whelk. And this bait harvest increased dramatically in the 1990s. However, they're also used for this chemical in their blood, this limulus amoebocyte lysate, which is extracted from horseshoe crab blood and has been used for decades to test for bacterial contamination, including in vaccines. And currently, the horseshoe crabs are collected, bled, and then returned to the water again. But it does have some mortality associated with it, this process. Here are the eggs in the bottom picture here. So the other character is the red knot, which is a sort of medium-sized migratory shorebird. And we're concerned here with this particular subspecies, rufa. Nests in the Arctic in Canada, winters down in South America. And so they have this really remarkably long migration, 15,000 kilometers at most. It's very physiologically demanding. And so they need a place to refuel and get a lot of food quickly in preparation for breeding as they move in their northward migration. And Delaware Bay serves as a principal stopover site. This bird was listed as threatened under the U.S. Endangered Species Act in 2014. And the reason for that is that they have suffered declines in recent decades. So this top time series shows in the gray bars, light gray, you see aerial counts that have been performed. So from an aircraft, these large flocks are, people are attempting to count how many birds are in them. So it's maybe a rough measure, but it seems like a pretty clear pattern of decline starting in the early 80s up, especially until around 2000. So this is one of the suspected causes of this is increase in harvest of horseshoe crabs, which you see at the bottom here. So here's 1 million pounds, this first line, and obviously dramatic increase during the 1990s. So given that decline of the red knot and the supposed connection with horseshoe crab harvest, there's a lot of tension in the early 2000s between shorebird conservationists, the fishing community, those regulating fisheries, and the biomedical industry. And decisions were being made in a not very structured way based on advocacy, the decisions about regulations were criticized as being opaque. Trade-offs were not explicit. Uncertainties were not out front and on the table. And so adaptive management was suggested as a way to improve decision-making and provide a means to replace controversy with a collaborative process. And in the wildlife and fisheries context, I'm using adaptive management to mean not only constructing a decision model and optimizing it, but also all the steps that come before that in gathering stakeholders, defining the problem and objectives, and then building a decision model. So you see at the bottom here, horseshoe crabs harvested with a dredge in the Delaware Bay. Here's where the crabs are being bled for their LAL and some more eggs. So just to cover some points of the original adaptive resource management program, once stakeholders came together and the problem was well defined, these were the sort of features that came out. The decision to be made, of course, is the harvest limits on bait harvest, and male and female horseshoe crabs are considered separately in those decisions. That happens every year. The decision maker is the ASMFC. The biomedical harvest, this adds a little twist to everything, is not regulated by ASMFC. So we're only talking about bait harvest as the thing that can be manipulated here. The stakeholders were the commercial fishers, bird conservationists, the LAL industry, and then other Delaware Bay residents with ecological or economic concerns. This is the objective statement that they came up with. They want to manage harvest of horseshoe crabs in the Delaware Bay to maximize harvest, but also maintain ecosystem integrity and provide adequate stopover habitat for migrating shorebirds. Those objectives boil down to maximizing horseshoe crab bait harvest and supporting shorebird populations, with the red knot serving as sort of an umbrella species representing all those other shorebirds. And then the desire was to sustain horseshoe crab and red knot populations into the future. It's a complex system to model. There are two very different species to consider. There's potential lags in the effects of harvest, and those could come much later in time. There was uncertainty, especially at the creation of the original ARM framework, of whether horseshoe crab population size affected red knots and how, and then a desire to reduce that uncertainty over time. The main trade-off here, of course, is that increased harvest was suspected as reducing egg density on the beaches, which meant that the red knots were not getting enough sustenance in preparation for breeding and having reduced populations as a result. So I'll just focus on one feature that was used to address the problem in the original ARM framework, and that was these multiple stakeholder-defined system models. Because there was uncertainty about how or whether red knots were affected by horseshoe crabs, there were these three models. In the first, about horseshoe crabs don't affect red knot populations at all. In the second, they affect reproduction only. And in the third, reproduction and survival of red knots. And then these models were weighted according to expert opinion. And so the prediction of red knot abundance in year T+1 is a weighted average of the three models' predictions. And the plan was to update these in a passive adaptive management approach. Stochastic dynamic programming was the tool for optimization, and the goal was to find for each system state the harvest that maximizes that long run value of horseshoe crab harvest. So the ASMFC adopted this ARM framework and began using it to set bait harvest in 2013, and it's been used ever since. But it has been periodically revisited. For instance, Dave Smith and colleagues found that there was a low expected value of perfect information. And so that was sort of a clue that the model set that I just showed, those 3 models, might not be sufficient. And then a double loop assessment, this arrow here in the adaptive management scheme, where the original decisions made at the setup phase were revisited, was done in 2016. And so there was evidence that maybe another revisitation of and another double loop process was in order. And so that began in 2019. And that's where my involvement began on this project. So the context had somewhat changed. We now had a lot more data on horseshoe crabs and red knots through the monitoring that had happened thanks to the original ARM framework. And the models that were available were more advanced for modeling those populations. The original optimization software that had been used was now unmaintained, so it couldn't be used anymore. And there were some limitations realized in the previous system models and the reward function. So I'll just summarize some of the changes that we made. Of course, this is a big, elaborate system. And once we sort of pulled on one thread, we realized we had to address a lot of different parts of things. We moved from decision variables that were discrete, these harvest packages that were used, to continuous parameters of continuous harvest functions, I'll call them. The optimization algorithm was changed from stochastic dynamic programming to this approximate dynamic programming, which I'll discuss in a second. The population models for both species were changed in several ways. Previously, they had used life stages. So for instance, juvenile stages that were not monitored and therefore hard to learn about just through monitoring. And a lot of the parameter values had been taken from outside Delaware Bay. So that was addressed, both those points were addressed with the new models. How the horseshoe crabs affect red knots, we got rid of the 3 competing weighted models that I discussed and replaced that with a single model with continuous parameters that specified the horseshoe crab effects. And then there was a major change to the reward function. And so previously, utility had come from horseshoe crab harvest, and red knot populations had acted as a constraint. But we felt that it better reflected the stakeholder input originally received when the ARM was first conceived, for both species to contribute utility to the reward. And so that's what you see here. This is the new reward function that we used. So reward in year T is an expression that makes use of utilities for horseshoe crabs, that's this UH, and for red knots, this UK. And these are both in the range from 0 to 1. And so not only do you sum them together, but you have a term where they're basically interacting. So UH here is the ratio of the monetary value received from horseshoe crab harvest to the maximum possible harvest, which was set in the original ARM framework, these hard upper limits to harvest. And then UK expresses how close red knot abundance is to an established conservation goal that we set. And so in this way, the decision model is obtaining utility from both horseshoe crab and red knot, or it's encouraged to do so, you might say. So we also changed the approach to optimization, and we kind of got forced to go in search of a new method because our new population models required that we, in order to predict populations in the next year, we needed to know abundance of horseshoe crabs 10 years ago and 9 years ago because of the slow maturation of horseshoe crabs, and 2 years ago for red knots. So this would have added many new state variables to the decision model. So we needed something that could get around that. So approximate dynamic programming and this particular policy approximation flavor of that is what we used. And to do this, we simulated the system forward over 100 years, 10,000 different iterations. And then over those 10,000 time paths, found the value as the sum of the annual rewards, took the average of that. And so essentially, we're able to take those 100 years and compress everything into a single value to optimize over. So in addition, the entire 100-year series of state variable values is available for doing calculations on, whatever that may be. And for us, that was using previous abundances to predict recruitment. It doesn't require discretizing any variables, allows use of a static optimization algorithm, and fairly new to wildlife and fisheries management. So here's a scheme of the new revised ARM framework. I know there's a lot in here that I haven't discussed, but basically the red boxes are the data that come in, and the orange are the estimation models for the populations. Horseshoe crabs on top here, red knot here. And then these feed into the simulation models in purple, which have exactly the same form as the estimation models. Then those are fed into the optimization step. So here's some what comes out of that optimization. This is the harvest surface for female horseshoe crabs, where the important states are, in order to get the recommended harvest, are the red knot abundance in thousands on the x-axis, female horseshoe crabs in millions on the y-axis. And this green region here shows where the simulated populations spent most of their time in years 1 to 10. So here, the dark red is the upper limit, 210,000 horseshoe crabs, and 0 is yellow. So as you sort of move through the simulation, here's the second decade, third decade, and then for the rest of the simulation, you can see that the most important states that determine the harvest surface are those within this green blob here. And here are some of the predictions that come out in the simulations: red knot populations on the top, female horseshoe crabs in the center, and male horseshoe crabs. So some conclusions here. So what's the status of this revised ARM? It's been peer reviewed now, and it's under consideration for use by ASMFC in setting harvest in the near future. So, and what we've found is that the use of the original ARM since 2013 has led to a lull in the controversy. It did not eliminate it. It's still there. So we hope that this ARM revision can lead to more of a constructive conversation again. But the ARM framework has benefits for ASMFC as the decision maker, we believe. It's transparent, it's defensible, it uses subjective and objective components to make the decision, the subjective being stakeholder values, objective being science, monitoring, optimization, and it has a clear separation between these two inputs. It also keeps science inextricably tied to the decision making, and provides a mechanism for continued involvement of stakeholders in this collaborative process over time. We think the program as a whole and also this revision have some rare qualities among at least in the context of wildlife and fisheries management. It's pretty rare for a full adaptive management program to be adopted by a natural resource regulatory agency. It's also somewhat rare for an adaptive management program to actually include all of the key features that presupposes. There's been a remarkable level of sustained institutional support and commitment to this program. It's actually gone through several rounds of double loop learning to improve models and optimization, et cetera. And then there's some other unique features, we believe. This multiple attribute reward function that doesn't assume additive independence of the two contributions from horseshoe crabs and red knots, but has that interactive term. It's a two-species system. One of the species is aquatic, one is terrestrial. That seems pretty rare. And for a fishery regulator to formally consider bird abundances in setting harvest is pretty unusual. So with that, I will thank you for your attention and show all my fellow team members here and take any questions. Thank you.
Well, that was great, Brian. Thanks so much. Very different from our first presentation and really interesting thing to think about. I'm going to first invite the judges to ask a question. I'm not seeing any hands up, but I guess they're coming up. Okay. Sorry. Pat, let's start with you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, really enjoyed the presentation. I had a question around to what extent, or maybe it was out of the scope of what you were doing, were substitutes considered? I'm not a fisherman, so I don't know much about it, but I would imagine that there are different things that could be used for bait other than horseshoe crabs. And then my understanding is that there's also now a synthetic version of LAL that is available, used in Europe primarily, I believe, but it's in some ways even considered superior to the horseshoe crab blood. So yeah, if you could touch on that, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yes, I think you're correct on both counts. I think part of the answer to this is that the ASMFC is a large deliberative body and is rather slow moving. And so I think that in particular, the changes in the source of test for contamination, the LAL substitute, will change the context for this whole conversation in the near future. But that hasn't really reached the level of the ASMFC decision-making, perhaps, quite yet. As for substitutes, I think you're correct about that too. If Dave Smith is willing to talk about that, yeah, I think he's the expert there.
Patrick's correct that there has been lots of attempts to create a substitute for the bait, and they have been unsuccessful. Many years attempts. There's something about the quality of the bait that's not replaceable. DuPont, in fact, got heavily involved in that for a number of years. We weren't able to do it. Now, you're also right that LAL, there's a synthetic version of that, but the industry has been reluctant to move from a tried and true product to a synthetic product that, although in the lab appears to have greater sensitivity to gram-negative bacteria, which is what they're worried about, there's a reluctance to move, but eventually they will, I think. But the bait question, I'm not sure about. I don't think there is a substitute on the horizon.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, great. Let's now go to Gary. Be sure to unmute.
Thank you. And I enjoyed the presentation very much. I had a question about the models, the 3 different models and the weights. So I had expected they might be different population dynamic models or different parameters, but they actually were 3 different hypotheses. And so I wondered if you're able to test the hypotheses and how that might have affected the weights. And then since there are three different hypotheses, how much variation there are in the three different forecasts, and how sensitive that your forecasts are to the weights. So in that variation.
Dave, do you want to speak to that, or should I take it?
Well, I'll take a quick stab at that. Gary, the three models represented three hypotheses with regard to how these two species are related, either not related at all, or that the weight that's gained by the red knot increases the adult survival, or the weight that's gained by the red knots feeding on horseshoe crab eggs affects both the recruitment of new red knots and the survival. So it's, there's three hypotheses there. There clearly is evidence for an effect, but the evidence that's been accumulated over the past 10 years is somewhat ambiguous on the recruitment, but stronger on the adult survival. So the revision actually moved towards one of those models, basically. It moved towards the weak effect on recruitment and the stronger effect on adult survival. So over time, there was kind of a learning that occurred.
Thank you.
Sorry, let's go to Nadia.
Thank you, Carol. Great presentation again. Thank you for this. Brian, you mentioned that you couldn't keep the initial optimization model because it was very difficult to maintain. And I was wondering if you could go back in time and get involved in the project from the very beginning. Is there anything, one thing that you would have done in a different way? So in other words, what is the key lesson learned? And the second question, if I can have a quick comment as well. In your intervention, there were many stakeholders involved. And can you give us a bit more information? Who were the main beneficiaries?
Thank you for the questions. If I had to go back in time and change something, I don't know what I would say to that. I think the particular software that was used originally is now obsolete, and but the approach used, that stochastic dynamic programming, a general approach, we had planned in the revision to maintain that same approach to optimization. We just found that we sort of changed one thing, those population models, and found that it was going to be easier to move to something else. So I don't know if I would presume to say that I would change anything at the beginning. I think one of the biggest advantages of the good work that was done at the beginning of the project was to give a justification for continued interest in monitoring both these species. And that's how all the data were accumulated over time that allowed us to move to these different models that perform better and are more influenced by data rather than hypotheses. So I think I wouldn't presume to say that I would change anything. Dave was actually there, so maybe he will say what he would change. Your question about stakeholders, can you give an example of like what you mean by what kind of description you were thinking?
Yeah, you had the fishermen, you had the fish, they are stakeholders. So I was thinking, who were the main beneficiaries from your work?
Well, I think that a lot of different groups benefited from the fact that the way that harvest was set and the discussions were had about this system moved from something that was based on controversy and antagonism to a more collaborative forum. And I think from what I understand, that really benefited everyone. There were fewer lawsuits and finger pointing. And so just the adoption of the formal process was perhaps the most beneficial part of all of this. And certainly the decision maker, ASMFC, benefited because that controversy, there was sort of a lull in that after they adopted the original program.
All right, well, thanks a lot, Brian. We have to move on to the next presentation. We've run over a little bit, but
Well,
great presentation, really interesting. There are a few questions in the chat that perhaps one of your team would like to mention. And now Hilda's put up the last slide here, which talks about the final presentation, prioritizing recommendations from critical incident reviews, multi-attribute utility theory in practice for resource-constrained teams. And I believe Veronica White will be kicking off this presentation. So Veronica, over to you. And everyone, please be sure to put your Veronica, you're muted. Your voice is muted.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can
My
hear you.
Zoom.
Yes, now we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for listening in today. My name is Veronica White. I'm a graduate research assistant with the National Institute of Justice, and I'm also a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in Industrial and Systems Engineering. And so me with some of my collaborators at NIJ work to help a federal reentry program to prioritize recommendations for program improvement by reviewing critical incidents. And specifically, we use multi-attribute utility theory to help kind of drive that recommendation prioritization. And so, and just if you don't know what the National Institute of Justice is, it's a research, development, and evaluation agency. And just as a disclaimer, the opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. And to provide some context of what we're kind of looking at is there are many different systems, programs, and procedures that really want to have the best systems, programs, and procedures and are constantly looking or might be looking to improve their programs. And sometimes when you go looking for program improvements, you can come back with a large, overwhelming set of recommendations and suggestions. And there may or may not be an easy way to reach consensus on where to actually start improving your process. And so this can lead teams to just kind of implement manageable tasks and leave some of those really important tasks that could really change the program that are more extensive behind. And this can be even more apparent in time-constrained teams where there's limited room for discussion to actually kind of talk through different potential program improvements because you're just focused on running the program. Okay. And so the program that we were setting out to help improve, we consulted with the Successful Transition and Reentry Together program, or START. And so what START is, it's a voluntary 4-phase federal reentry court program that's run by the Eastern District of Wisconsin. And the purpose of START is to reduce recidivism for individuals that are on probation or parole that have a high risk of reoffending. And for participating in START, individuals can receive up to a year off of their term of supervised release, which can range anywhere from a few years to 10 or 15 years. And so this program really can have, and it kind of does this by creating structured programming and providing resources for individuals in the program so it can really make a difference in their lives. And how someone kind of moves through the program is once someone's released to federal probation or parole, they'll have some amount of time of a TSR or term of supervised release. At that time, they may choose to start the START program. And if they do, they kind of go through the 4 phases of the program that can take up a minimum of 1 year, but oftentimes can be longer. For example, if an individual is not meeting requirements of a phase or failing to kind of meet program requirements, they might spend a little bit longer in that phase before they kind of move on. And then once START's completed, they receive that 1 year off their TSR. And then if there's any remaining TSR, they would serve that. And then assuming they don't reoffend or violate their probation or parole, they then would successfully re-enter society once their term of supervised release is complete. And so individuals that, so the START team is actually comprised of a variety of individuals across the criminal justice system, from the federal judiciary, prosecution and defense lawyers, probation and parole officers, people in the Bureau of Prisons and residential reentry centers. And so these are kind of our core decision makers that we were working with to kind of improve the program. And from working with them, they originally came to us and said, we really want to improve the START program by increasing our completion rate. But as we kind of moved through our process, as I'll kind of describe later, they realized that, you know, their ultimate goal isn't, while increasing completion of START is great, their ultimate goal is really completion of individuals' term of supervised release, and making sure that they, you know, complete their probation or parole without reoffending. And so our approach kind of consisted of 2 main parts. The first part, it was actually just generating program recommendations and improvements. And we specifically used a Sentinel event review process for that. And then second was, once we kind of had that list of program improvements, we then used decision science to help them manage, you know, actually implementing those program recommendations. And so what a Sentinel event review process is, it consists of a few main parts, but generally a Sentinel event review is grounded in root cause analysis, and it's a type of critical incident review. And so, for example, in START, a Sentinel event is where an individual is terminated from the START program. That's what we initially set out with starting our review. We actually did 4 consecutive Sentinel event reviews, where we went through the timeline of each individual's case, bringing together all the different individuals' information, all the START team members' information that they might have had, and looking at the data that they might have had to kind of figure out what were preventative measures that could have helped the individual not have failed the program. And so a big part of this is just kind of bringing everyone together and focusing on all the different information, try to really, see how could we prevent the same thing from happening to somebody else in the future. And a big focus of our approach was to really empower the START team to be able to continue to use the processes we were using on their own. So while we facilitated the first 3 reviews, we actually had the lead of the program, the judge, facilitate the 4th review. And so they could get a handle of actually, you know, starting to look through these cases themselves and where to kind of focus their time and how to keep track of recommendations. And so this was over the course of 5 1 to 1.5 hour sessions that took place over several months. The team doesn't have a lot of time to really get together. So it was just kind of this long process, but still a very good process. And by applying the Sentinel event review process, we were able to have 3 main outcomes from that. So first was streamlined communication among team members of the START team. We also made improvements to their data set management and allowed them to help monitor the program, maybe identify when the next case review should be based on that. And also it resulted in 28 specific recommendations for the START team to implement. And so for an idea of streamlined communication, we created a process map. And this just lists all of the different kinds of information that the different stakeholders or team members of the START program have on individuals. And so just even putting this all out there on one uniform document, it really helped them see, oh, if only I had access to, those program reviews earlier, so I could get them connected to that kind of programming when they start. So just even seeing all of this really just kind of helps increase communication and just see the power of what the team already knew and just kind of consolidate it into one place. So they really knew what kind of questions to even ask different individuals on their team. So we also created a variety of pivot tables and pivot charts in Excel, because that's what they have accessible on their systems. The person that's managing the database is a parole officer who has no training in data management. So just creating something that was visually appealing and useful for them to quickly identify, overall how the program is going. Are people graduating, being terminated, or voluntarily leaving the program? How often or what total? And ultimately, are the individuals in each of those groups having their TSR successfully discharged or getting it revoked and being sent back to prison? Another example is we actually help them identify some different areas of additional data to collect on individuals. So they weren't collecting before we met with them, like what phase of the START program individuals were in when they were terminated from the program. But just quickly from recollecting that data and looking at it, you can see that, okay, maybe we need to focus on improving the beginning phases of the START program first, right? To kind of get more people further along. And so ultimately, our Sentinel event review resulted in 5 main themes or root causes as to why an individual was terminated from the START program. And it led to gaps in mental health care, unclear program procedures, poor information sharing, lack of mentoring, and lack of continuity in education and job training. And so this was specifically related to 28, or led to 28 specific recommendations for the team to implement. And so this kind of moves us to that second piece of our work, which was actually using decision analysis to help kind of manage those 28 recommendations. As you could probably imagine, the recommendations were of varying complexity, cost, and scope. And the START staff have limited time to really to collaborate. And a lot of their time is really focused on just on running the program. And if they have extra time, it'd be great if they could actually discuss how, like, actually implementing an improvement rather than how, which improvement to go after. And so there, and just from giving the list, you could tell right away that, there's a lack of consensus in terms of where to actually start. So what we did was we reframed this as a multi-criteria decision-making problem, where the decision is how to kind of prioritize these different recommendations and what order to kind of start tackling them. And specifically, we use multi-attribute utility theory and developed MARA, which is a multi-attribute utility assessment, specifically in mind that the team is time constrained and just wanted to really give them structure and something that they could use and something that they could understand and get behind to further, and just keep using in the future to aid program improvement. And so MARA consisted of 6 key attributes. For example, how big of an impact would that recommendation have on individuals in the START program? Is there any evidence that exists or research that exists to kind of support that type of programming? Are there sufficient resources for the team to kind of implement it? How sustainable do you think the change would be? And how likely do you think it would be implemented? And this is more just like how much pushback do you think they would get from their the relevant agencies in charge of implementing that recommendation? And lastly, how important did they think that the rest recommendation is to them personally? And as you can kind of see, so the bullet points are just kind of examples of some of the wording that we use to describe the questions, but and each of the questions had an equal weight except for importance, and this was intentionally, it was doubly weighted because this is really pulling from implementation science, where you're trying to make a change in an organization. It really is key to have buy-in from individuals and to have a champion that can kind of keep pushing a recommendation or something forward so that they can kind of overcome potential barriers that are happening in trying to create that program improvement. And so by kind of focusing on how important they are, or hoping that we kind of create champions within the team and increase buy-in of the top recommendations until they kind of get this process of improving their program a bit more outlined. And once they kind of have a couple under their belt, they can kind of it'll be easier for them to kind of keep making changes. And so how did we actually implement MARA? Well, we really wanted to give them a kind of reiterative framework that they could use again and again as they kind of implement recommendations, and and they could just kind of keep using to reprioritize, rescore things as they learned more information and added new recommendations or completed others. And so the first was, kind of identify or update that list of recommendations, which is how we created that Sentinel event review, and they might potentially do more Sentinel event reviews in the future so that the things could get updated. Then we developed the attributes, and we got feedback from the team in terms of what did they think was important in terms of talking about recommendations. And then we actually reduced the original 28 list to a smaller, more manageable set to score. Since they are heavily time constrained, I thought it'd be easier for them to look to first rank a reduced list. And we did this by just asking each individual their top 5 recommendations before doing MARA. And then we created a smaller list of 12 recommendations that were endorsed by 3 or more team members as their top. And so again, this is kind of to create buy-in, create champions for these first couple recommendations that they do this cycle through. We also created MARA in SurveyMonkey, which is a tool that was already available and being used by the team for other areas of the program. And so they were familiar and able to take the MARA assessment pretty easily. We then discussed the results of the ranking recommendations with the team, and now they're in the process of actually implementing a few of those top recommendations. And so just so you can kind of see the results of what the tool, this is the 12 recommendations that that were originally scored, where the gray is the top score for that attribute, among the 12. And just for an example of what a recommendation might be, so for example 8 was something that would change the structure of the START program itself, where they would use incentives or deterrents that are ratcheted rather than an all or nothing kind of incentive or deterrent. And what that could maybe look like is maybe adding a week or 2 to a START phase if they're failing drug tests or not going to program meetings. Or alternatively, it could be a sort of incentive where maybe they're getting some sort of compensation that increases the more that they the more that they stay compliant with the program. And this kind of is drawn from behavioral science and psychology. And that's where that kind of recommendation came from. So that's an example. And ultimately, what kind of contribution did MARA have to the decision? Well, it was received really positively by the START staff because it improved their communication, and it helps them provide them a framework of how to actually discuss, what's important to them in terms of how to focus their program improvement, and gave them a framework to do that. It outlined the steps for them and gave them clear direction in terms of which ones to start with. And that list of prioritized recommendations or improvements was it was also done in a meaningful way to them, where they really had buy-in and were confident in the results of that tool. And they're even excited to use it again as they kind of keep going through this. So in conclusion, a large list of recommendations can be overwhelming to implement, and prioritization of recommendations can be reframed as a multi-criteria decision-making problem, specifically using multi-attribute utility theory. We created MARA, which was designed in a way to empower the time-constrained teams to use decision analysis more regularly in their practices. And we implemented it following a Sentinel event review of a resource-constrained federal reentry program. And just as like kind of a note, the full report of the Sentinel event review and what's kind of presented here will be made publicly available on the NIJ website. And so you can look for a future recommendation or a future publication titled that way. Yeah, I just want to give a special thanks to the Eastern District of Wisconsin START team. They're doing some really great work, and it was wonderful to get to work with them on their vision. So yeah, and with that, questions.
Okay, thanks a lot, Veronica.
Yeah.
Such an impactful project to work on. I'm sure it was really exciting. So let's see if we have any, I'm having a problem today, but seeing who has asked a question. Any hands raised among our, we have Nadia.
Yes, thank you, Carol, and thank you, Veronica. Great presentation again. Veronica, in your intervention, you took into account a number of conflicting criteria, impact evidence, resources, and so on. And could you please reiterate how you made sure that you had the right set of criteria in order to assess the different recommendations? And if I could also have a quick comment from you about the impact of this kind of work. For example, did you go back to the decision makers to see how useful they found the intervention? How did you assess impact and success for this kind of project? Thank you.
Yeah, so for the first part of the question, sorry. Yeah, we really, in terms of selecting the criteria or the attributes, first we kind of discussed amongst ourselves, the four of my coworkers, and we tried to really pull from implementation science in terms of trying to figure out the different aspects that as to why recommendations might fail, right? Because we really wanted to set them up for success, and especially while in those first few, while they're still trying to develop how to actually improve their program, how to go about that process, and how to facilitate those discussions, just making sure that, it would, they were aware of the problems or the issues that it might have, and that really think about, the costs associated with it. And really, this is just in the idea phase of a recommendation. And when we created those attributes, we also discussed, we had a 30-minute discussion with the START team itself on the attributes themselves, and adjusted some of our wording of the questions. Ultimately, they didn't really have any feedback on the attributes themselves. They thought it was wonderful. They had never really seen something like this. So, in future recommendations and in our return report back to them, we kind of provided them with additional feedback on how to keep revising the tool, and even made sure that they knew that they could keep changing the tool if they thought there was a different thing that was important to them. Because it's really just making sure that they can do those program improvements. So yeah, so that was the first part, and I'm forgetting what the second part of your question was.
How did you go on about assessing the success of the project?
Yeah, and so yeah, for us, success of the project was really, having our stakeholders embrace some more systems thinking and decision analysis techniques into their practices. Really for them being able to, own the MARA tool and have it in their SurveyMonkey account so that they can revise and use it and look at the results themselves. really working with the data set that they already had and just kind of adapting it and meeting with the person in charge of their data sets to see if it was usable, functional, potentially so that, they could keep using those charts themselves and it made sense. And really just making sure that they can run their own Sentinel event reviews when they feel like there's a particular case that, went horribly, went wrong. And by having them facilitate that last one, we would say that was pretty successful.
Thank you.
Carol, you're muted.
Thanks, Veronica.
Oh, there.
So we're a little bit over time, but I want to ask one question that's been submitted versus the via the chat, and I'm going to read it to you. High correlation between the importance attribute, the last one, versus to total ranking. How does this change with sensitivity to double counting the importance?
That's a good question. We didn't, I don't think we actually specifically looked at the sensitivity of having it doubly weighted or not. And so that definitely could be something that we look at and just make the team aware of, is that by doubly weighting, it does kind of maybe change the results. But also, if it is sensitive, I'm not really upset about that because the purpose is really to increase buy-in, because that can really help the team, power through some challenges in implementing it as they kind of get along the way, because they're really championing for that change to happen. So
great. Okay, well, thanks a lot, Veronica, and thanks to all of our finalists who presented or were online during the presentations. I'd like to thank all of the people who participated in the committee during this process. And of course, all of the people who have called in to hear the presentations. As mentioned at the beginning, we'll be announcing the finalist. Gilberto will be announcing it on October 17th at the Informs meeting. And I'm sure we'll be sending out an announcement about it. So again, thanks. And we'll be looking forward to seeing you all again next year. Goodbye, everyone.